I pulled my coat tighter as I stepped onto Wall Street in downtown Asheville, the winter air sharp against my skin. The marketplace stood just ahead, its warm glow spilling across the sidewalk. I'd chosen it carefully elegant enough for the occasion, but not ostentatious. Tonight was my father's 60th birthday, and I had planned every detail to make it unforgettable. The hostess led me to the private dining area I had reserved, a corner room with tall brick walls and soft lighting. Fresh flowers were arranged in the center of the long table, the kind Dad liked deep red carnations mixed with sprigs of pine. I had arrived early, wanting to confirm the wine selection, the dessert, even the placement of the chairs. Everything had to be just right. For years. I had been the one holding this family together, though no one seemed to notice. From my small apartment in Charlotte, I had wired money for medical bills, truck repairs, tuition, even the roof over their heads. I told myself it was love, that giving meant I belonged. But there was always a part of me that wondered if I was simply buying a seat at the table. Tonight, I wanted no doubts. Tonight, my father would smile, my mother would soften, and my brothers would remember I was more than the sister who wrote checks. I wanted us to feel like a family again, even if it was only for a few hours. I slipped the small velvet box from my purse and placed it discreetly beside my plate. Inside was the watch Dad had once admired through a store window, its navy face shining under the lights. It had cost more than I'd budgeted, but I didn't care. He deserved something beautiful after the year he'd endured. As I adjusted the silverware one final time, I heard laughter echoing from the restaurant entrance. My family had arrived, and with them, the beginning of a night I would never forget. Growing up in Asheville meant that my world stretched from the Blue Ridge Parkway to the cracked sidewalks of our neighborhood, but inside our house, it revolved around my two brothers. Julian, 3 years older, was the golden boy, tall, broad-shouldered, and gifted on the football field. He carried my mother's pride like a crown. She bragged about his touchdowns to anyone who would listen, as if his victories belonged to her. Then there was Damon, 2 years younger, quick-witted and endlessly forgiven. He had a way of turning mistakes into stories that made everyone laugh. Teachers overlooked his half-finished homework, and my mother excused every late night and broken rule with a shake of her head and a soft smile. And me, I was simply Celine. Quiet, bookish, more at home in the library than on the field or stage. My report cards came back with perfect grades, but my achievements always seemed to earn faint praise compared to my brothers. "She's smart," my mother would say, "but not a natural leader like Julian." Or, "She's focused, but Damon has such charm." Each qualifier left its mark. When the recession hit in 2008, I was 15. I watched my parents whisper over bills at the kitchen table, my father's hands rough and restless from construction jobs that no longer paid enough. My mother's face grew lined with worry. That was the year I stopped dreaming small. While Julian talked about scholarships and Damon drifted toward music, I decided I would study finance. Numbers, at least. Couldn't play favorites. I started working part-time at a diner after school, saving every dollar. I believed that if I could help carry the weight that pressed on our family, maybe then I'd finally be more than just the overlooked daughter. The sound of footsteps approaching the restaurant table brought me back to the present, and I braced myself as my family filled the room. At UNC Chapel Hill, I thought I had finally stepped into a life of my own. I had earned a scholarship that covered tuition and books, and between tutoring economics freshmen and interning at a local investment firm, I kept myself afloat. My roommates spent weekends at Franklin Street bars, but I worked late shifts in the library, convincing myself that discipline was the key to freedom. The first call came during my junior year. My father's truck, the one he relied on for construction jobs, had broken down. The repair shop in Asheville quoted $500, money he didn't have. "It's okay if you can't," he said over the phone, but I wired the money that same night, skipping textbooks I had planned to buy. 2 months later, Mom called about an unexpected medical bill. This time it was $300. "We'll pay you back," she promised. They never did. Then Damon needed tuition for community college, $2,000 to keep him enrolled. I covered that too, telling myself family came first. By senior year, nearly half my internship salary was being sent back home. After graduation, when I landed a financial analyst job in Charlotte with a solid starting salary, I thought things might settle. Instead, the requests multiplied. When Dad's chest pains led to surgery, the bills were staggering. Insurance covered some, but not nearly enough. I emptied my savings, nearly $18,000, and still took out a personal loan. Later, I helped with the mortgage $12,000 spread over 2 years to keep them from defaulting. Add to that Damon's tuition and Julian's truck when it was repossessed, and I barely noticed how quickly the numbers added up. I lived in a studio apartment furnished with second-hand chairs, drove a Honda on its last legs, and bought groceries in bulk to stretch each paycheck. Meanwhile, family dinners and new household appliances appeared whenever I visited Asheville. I told myself it was temporary, that my sacrifices meant I was needed, maybe even loved. But in truth, I had become something else entirely, the family ATM. The hum of conversation in the marketplace dimmed when my family entered, coats brushed with cold air from the street. I rose to greet them, hugging Dad first. He looked healthy, the color back in his cheeks after last year's surgery. His blazer, the one I'd bought him for Christmas, sitting neatly on his shoulders. For a moment, that sight alone made every sacrifice feel worth it. We settled around the table, menus passed, candles flickering against the brick walls. The server brought the Cabernet I'd requested, and Dad's eyes lit up when he recognized the label. "My favorite," he said, clapping my shoulder. I smiled, saying nothing about the $80 price tag. Tonight wasn't about numbers. When the time for gifts came, I waited until the others had gone first. Julian handed over a polo shirt and woodworking book. Damon slid across a framed fishing photo from last summer. Both gifts were simple, thoughtful in their way, and Dad thanked them warmly. Then I reached for the velvet box at my side. "This one's from me," I said, sliding it across the linen. Dad opened it slowly, and when the Omega Seamaster caught the light, his breath caught too. It was the same watch he'd once admired in the window of a shop at Biltmore Village, pausing just long enough for me to remember. "Celine," he whispered, his voice thick. His eyes shone as I helped fasten the strap around his wrist. "It's perfect." For that brief second, I felt I belonged. But as I looked up, Julian's smile was tight, his eyes fixed on the watch with a shadow I knew too well. Damon let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "That must have cost a fortune," he muttered. Half a joke, half something else. Across the table, Mom's expression hardened, her lips pressed together, and I saw in her eyes not pride, not gratitude, but something colder, sharper, waiting for its turn to surface. The first comment slid out so smoothly I almost convinced myself I had misheard it. We had just ordered appetizers when Mom leaned back in her chair, smiling tightly as the server walked away. "Not everyone can afford places like this," she said, her eyes landing on me. "But I suppose when you're single with no responsibilities, it's easy to be generous." Julian chuckled, raising his glass. Damon joined in with a low laugh, as though it were all a harmless joke. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but forced myself to take a sip of wine instead of responding. Dad tried to redirect the moment, recalling one of his old job sites, but before long, Mom struck again. "Celine, you must be logging 60-hour weeks to keep up with your lifestyle. No wonder you don't have time for real life." She paused, letting the words linger like smoke. "Some people can be so obsessed with money, they forget about warmth." Julian leaned toward Damon. "Remember how she used to make spreadsheets for her allowance," he said, laughing. "She was 10 going on 40. Damon grinned. "Still is. Only now the spreadsheets are probably for her bank account." I pressed my hands together under the table, nails biting into my palms. Dad cleared his throat and spoke louder than necessary about his favorite woodworking project, but his voice faded beneath their laughter. The memory of my recent breakup flickered in my mind, and before I could shake it off, Mom delivered the next blow. Marcus was right. You know, a man doesn't want to compete with numbers and deadlines forever. The words cut deeper than she could have imagined. The breakup was still raw, and hearing his name, turned into a weapon at this table, left me dizzy. The candles flickered against the brick walls, shadows stretching across their faces. I wondered if anyone else at the restaurant could sense the shift at our table, the subtle cruelty disguised as banter, the easy way my family turned me into a punchline. Each laugh from my brothers, each sideways glance from my mother, felt like another incision. And as I sat there smiling tightly, swallowing back the sting, I knew the cuts were beginning to draw blood. By the time entrees were cleared, I felt like I had been through a dozen small battles. My father tried valiantly to keep the mood afloat, sharing stories from his younger years. But each time I spoke, my mother found a way to twist it into something sharp. When I mentioned a recent promotion, she smiled with false sweetness. Of course Celine's moving up. She always knows how to buy affection. The words landed like a slap. My fork hovered in the air, the taste gone from my mouth. Julian and Damon chuckled uneasily, avoiding my eyes while Dad shook his head. Aurelia, enough. This is supposed to be a celebration. But Mom wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her wine glass balanced delicately in her hand. It's true, Robert. All these grand gestures, the expensive dinners, the flashy watch. Celine's always been good at throwing money around. She thinks that makes her important. A dry laugh escaped her lips. And then, as if the moment demanded cruelty, she added, "But it doesn't matter what she buys. She's not even part of this family." For a heartbeat, no one moved. The clatter of dishes and hum of conversation from the dining room beyond seemed to stop at the door. Even the waiter carrying a tray paused, uncertain whether to approach. The sentence echoed in my mind, the words unraveling the years of sacrifice I had carried like armor. I stared at my mother, at the triumphant tilt of her chin, and then at my father. He looked stricken, caught between loyalty and disbelief. Julian shifted in his seat, suddenly fascinated with his glass of water. Damon's smirk faltered into something closer to fear. My hands trembled beneath the table, but I kept my face still, my breath even. Inside, something cracked open a quiet rupture that I knew could never be mended. I reached for my wine, lifting the glass with a steadiness that surprised even me. The room seemed to tilt, every eye fixed on me, waiting to see if I would cry, argue, or flee. Instead, I smiled faintly, the stem of the glass cool against my fingers, and prepared to speak. I lifted my glass, the stem steady in my hand, though my pulse hammered in my ears. My mother's smirk lingered, but I could see curiosity flicker in her eyes when I finally spoke. "Perfect," I said evenly, my voice clear enough to carry down the table. "Then don't ask me for any more money." The words fell into the silence like a stone. For once, no one laughed. I set the glass back on the table, folding my hands. Let's be honest. Shall we $18,000 for Dad's surgery? $12,000 to cover the mortgage over the last 2 years. $8,000 when Julian's car was repossessed. $6,000 for Damon's tuition that he never finished. $4,000 for the new roof. $3,000 for the furnace repair last winter. I watched the numbers land, one by one, each heavier than the last. Damon's grin slipped into something hollow, and Julian's shoulders sagged as he stared at the tablecloth. My father looked as though I had struck him, his eyes wide and searching. "And tonight," I added, gesturing to the plates, "the wine, the flowers. $350 for this dinner, all so Dad could celebrate with the people he loves, paid for by the daughter who apparently isn't even part of this family. My mother's face shifted in an instant, triumph draining into panic. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. She hadn't expected me to say it aloud, to reveal the quiet ledger I had carried for years. The silence around us deepened. Even the children stopped fidgeting, sensing something irreversible. I lifted my glass again, took a slow sip, and set it down without breaking eye contact. The truth was finally on the table, and there was no taking it back. The waiter approached cautiously, glancing between me and my family as if weighing how to step into the tension. I slid my credit card from its folder and placed it firmly in his hand. "Actually," I said, keeping my tone calm, "bring me a separate check, just mine." My father's head snapped up. "Celine, don't." But I didn't look at him. I kept my eyes on the waiter until he nodded and disappeared toward the register. The silence that followed was unbearable, punctured only by the clink of Julian setting down his fork too hard. Damon muttered something under his breath, but I didn't bother to ask what. When the slip arrived, I signed it quickly, leaving a generous tip. My share, my dinner, my wine, nothing more. I stood, slinging my purse over my shoulder, and let my gaze sweep across the table one last time. Their faces looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth they had tried to bury. Outside, the air bit against my skin, the Asheville night sharp and clear. I walked past the Art Deco storefronts of Pack Square, the cool light from the street lamps throwing long shadows across the brick. Relief seeped into me with each step. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for holding anyone together. By the time I reached Charlotte, my phone was buzzing relentlessly. Voicemails stacked up, Dad pleading for me to call back, Julian insisting we could fix things, Damon half joking but with panic in his voice. I listened to none of them. Then came the final message. My mother's voice, thick but steady. "Celine, I shouldn't have said what I did, but you can't just walk away. We can't keep up the mortgage without your help. Your father's medical bills aren't finished. The credit cards are maxed. You know we need you." I let the phone fall silent on the counter, her words echoing louder than the others. It wasn't love she was reaching for. It was survival. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet. At first, the messages came daily. Dad explaining they were short on the mortgage. Julian confessing that he had hidden their financial dependence from his wife. Damon admitting he'd been evicted and was sleeping on a friend's couch. Each call ended the same way with some version of "we need you." But I didn't pick up. I couldn't. For once, I chose myself. I booked a solo trip to Maui, something I'd put off for years because there was always another bill, another crisis. The sound of waves against black rock cliffs, the scent of plumeria, the sunsets spilling across the Pacific. Everything felt like it belonged only to me. I read novels on the beach, let the sun soak into my skin, and felt my shoulders finally loosen. Back in Charlotte, I returned to work sharper, more focused. My boss noticed, praising my energy, handing me new projects I would have been too drained to accept before. I also began therapy, where I said aloud things I had never dared, that I had been buying love, that my family had mistaken sacrifice for duty. Meanwhile, without me, they began to adjust. Dad picked up consulting work, old contacts in construction calling him for advice. Julian, pressed by his wife, finally set up a budget and stuck to it. Damon found a full-time job, trading late nights for steady pay. They weren't thriving, but they were surviving, and for once, I wasn't the net beneath them. Sitting in my apartment one evening, suitcase still half unpacked from Hawaii, I realized I was free. For the first time in years, my life was truly my own. A year passed before I set foot in Asheville again. The call had come from Dad. Mom had suffered a mild heart attack. It wasn't life-threatening, but it forced a pause, A reckoning. Weeks later, I received a letter in her handwriting, 5 pages of raw confession. She admitted her jealousy, her bitterness, the way my independence had made her feel small. Instead of being proud, she wrote, "I resented you. I punished you for succeeding where I felt I had failed. I read it 3 times before I believed it. Time and therapy had softened her, made her words different, less sharp, more human. She didn't ask for money, only the chance to try again. So when Dad turned 61, I agreed to come. We gathered once more at the marketplace, the same restaurant where everything had broken apart. But this time, there were no jabs, no tight smiles. When the bill came, Julian slid his card in first. Damon handed over cash. Dad added what he could. I paid my share. No more, no less. For the first time, I wasn't carrying anyone. As the glasses rose in a toast, I caught Mom's gaze across the table. Her smile was tentative but real. And for once, I didn't search it for hidden barbs. Dad raised his voice above the clink of silverware. "To family," he said. I lifted my glass with the rest, but the word felt different on my tongue. I wasn't part of this family because of what I provided. I was part of it because I demanded to be seen, to be respected, to be loved for who I was. In the end, what makes you family the money you give, or the love you refuse to sell?